Long before the Vietnam War began, Vietnam was a peaceful land filled with rice fields, rivers, and mountains. Families lived in small villages, children helped their parents in the fields, and people depended on the land and water to survive. But hidden beneath this peaceful life were years of struggle, struggles that began long before the 1950s. To truly understand the Vietnam War, we must go back in time, far back, to when Vietnam was ruled by others. In the late 1800s, Vietnam was not an independent country. It was part of a large colony ruled by France, along with Laos and Cambodia. Together, these three places were called French Indochina. The French controlled everything: the government, the trade, and even the land. They built roads and railways, but not for the Vietnamese people. They built them to move resources like rice, rubber, and minerals out of the country and into Europe. Vietnamese farmers worked long hours on plantations owned by the French. They earned very little while French businesses grew rich. Many Vietnamese felt anger and sadness. They wanted freedom, the right to rule their own land. In the early 1900s, Vietnamese thinkers, teachers, and young students started to talk quietly about independence. One of those young men was Nguyen Tat Thanh, later known to the world as Ho Chi Minh. He left Vietnam as a young man, traveling across the world, to France, Britain, and even the United States, working small jobs, learning about politics, and dreaming of a free Vietnam. When World War I ended in 1918, many people around the world hoped for freedom and self-rule. Ho Chi Minh tried to speak to world leaders, asking for Vietnam's independence, but nobody listened. That disappointment stayed with him for life. By the 1920s, Ho Chi Minh became inspired by communism, a political idea that promised equality for workers and an end to colonial rule. He helped form the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, a movement that secretly worked to free Vietnam from France. The French government didn't like this at all. They arrested and punished anyone who spoke against their rule. But that only made the Vietnamese people more determined to fight for freedom. Then came World War II. In 1940, France was defeated by Germany, and its colonies became weak. This gave Japan, another powerful country, the chance to invade Vietnam. The Japanese army took control, but they allowed French officials to stay in some positions of power. To ordinary Vietnamese people, it didn't matter much. One foreign ruler was simply replaced by another. Food became scarce. In 1945, a terrible famine struck northern Vietnam. Crops failed and rice was taken away by Japanese soldiers to feed their own army. More than 1 million Vietnamese people died of hunger. It was one of the darkest moments in their history. During this time, Ho Chi Minh formed a resistance group called the Viet Minh, short for the League for the Independence of Vietnam. The Viet Minh fought both the Japanese and the French, using the mountains and jungles as their shelter. Villagers supported them by sharing food, supplies, and information. When World War II ended in 1945, Japan surrendered. The French, weakened by the war, were not ready to return to power right away. For a short time, it seemed like Vietnam might finally be free. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before a crowd in Hanoi and read out the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam. His words were calm, but full of emotion. He even quoted the American Declaration of Independence, saying, "All men are created equal. The Creator has given us certain rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." People cheered and waved flags. It was a proud day. Vietnam was finally free. Or so they thought. But the story didn't end there. The French didn't want to lose their colonies. They wanted to take Vietnam back. Soon after Japan's defeat, French troops returned, this time facing a Vietnamese population that no longer wanted them. In 1946, fighting broke out between the French army and the Viet Minh. This was called the First Indochina War. It lasted for nearly 8 long years. The French had modern weapons, airplanes, and tanks. The Viet Minh had determination, courage, and knowledge of their land. They fought in jungles, mountains, and villages. The Viet Minh used guerrilla warfare, small, quick attacks, often in the dark or from hidden positions. They would strike suddenly, disappear into the jungle, and reappear elsewhere. This kind of fighting confused and frustrated the French soldiers. The war destroyed villages, took countless lives, and left the country divided and poor. But through it all, the Vietnamese people did not give up their dream of independence. In 1954, the French decided to trap the Viet Minh in a valley called Dien Bien Phu. They built a large base surrounded by mountains, confident they could not be defeated. But the Viet Minh had other plans. They secretly carried heavy weapons up the mountains, piece by piece, and surrounded the French base. Then they attacked with full force. The battle lasted 55 days. In the end, the French army surrendered. It was a huge victory for the Viet Minh and a shock to the world. France had been defeated by a small Asian nation fighting for freedom. After the French defeat, world leaders gathered in Geneva, Switzerland, to decide what would happen next. This meeting became known as the Geneva Conference of 1954. They agreed to a temporary peace. Vietnam would be divided into 2 parts, the North, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communists, the South, led by a pro-Western government supported by the United States. The dividing line was set at the 17th parallel, a line across the middle of the country. Elections were supposed to be held within 2 years to unite Vietnam again, but those elections never happened. Why didn't the elections take place? Because the world had entered a new kind of war, the Cold War. On one side were the United States and its allies supporting democracy and capitalism. On the other side were the Soviet Union and China supporting communism. Vietnam became caught in the middle of this global struggle. America feared that if Vietnam became fully communist, other countries in Asia might follow. This idea was called the domino theory, like a row of dominoes falling one after another. So instead of helping to unify the country, the world's powers began to choose sides. In the North, Ho Chi Minh built a communist government. His message was about equality, unity, and independence from foreign powers. People worked on collective farms, factories were nationalized, and education became free.
In the South, the leader Ngo Dinh Diem ruled with the support of the U.S. He opposed communism but was strict and sometimes cruel. Many people in the South felt unhappy under his rule, especially Buddhists, who made up most of the population. The division created tension and fear. Families were split. Brothers lived in the North, sisters in the South. Old friends found themselves on opposite sides of an invisible border. The hope for peace slowly began to fade. In the late 1950s, small groups in South Vietnam began to resist Diem's government. Some of these rebels were supported by the North. They formed a group called the Viet Cong, short for Vietnamese Communists. The Viet Cong wanted to unite the country under Ho Chi Minh's rule. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, traps, and surprise attacks. The South's army struggled to stop them. The U.S. began sending military advisors to help train South Vietnamese troops. What started as small clashes slowly grew into something much bigger, something that would soon draw the entire world's attention. By the early 1960s, Vietnam was a land divided in every sense, politically, geographically, and emotionally. In the North, people rebuilt after years of war and believed in a unified communist future. In the South, people lived in fear. Fear of the Viet Cong, fear of government soldiers, and fear of what might come next. Villages were torn between two sides. Some supported the North, others the South, but most ordinary people just wanted peace. They wanted to grow rice, send their children to school, and live without the sound of bombs or guns. But peace was no longer in their hands. The decisions that would shape their lives were being made in faraway capitals, in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. And soon, Vietnam would become the center of one of the most painful wars in modern history. The story of the Vietnam War did not begin with explosions or gunfire. It began with a longing for freedom, a simple dream that every nation and every person understands. But as the world's powerful countries pulled Vietnam into their own battles of ideology, that dream became tangled in politics, fear, and war. The seeds of conflict were now planted deep in the soil of Vietnam, and soon they would grow into one of the longest and most controversial wars the world had ever seen. When the Geneva Agreement of 1954 divided Vietnam into North and South, many people hoped it would only be temporary, that elections would soon reunite the country peacefully. But instead, the line at the 17th parallel became more than just a border. It became a wall of distrust, fear, and suspicion. Vietnam, a nation that once shared the same language, culture, and traditions, was now split in two. One side looked to communism and independence. The other turned to democracy and Western support. And between them stood millions of ordinary people who simply wanted peace. In the North, the government was led by Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionary who had fought against the French. He was loved by many for his simplicity. He lived in a small wooden house, wore simple clothes, and ate the same food as the common people. The North's government followed communist ideas with help from the Soviet Union and China. They built factories, schools, and hospitals and encouraged everyone to work together for the country. But life was not easy. The economy was weak, and years of war had destroyed much of the land. In the South, the leader was Ngo Dinh, a strong-willed and deeply religious man. He believed in fighting communism and keeping Vietnam independent from Northern influence. The United States supported Diem with money, weapons, and military training because they feared that if Vietnam turned communist, the rest of Asia might follow, like falling dominoes. This fear was known as the domino theory. American leaders believed that if one country in Asia fell to communism, others, like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Indonesia, would fall too. And so, the United States became more and more involved in Vietnam's future. At first, Ngo Dinh appeared to be the right man for the job. He was educated, spoke French, and was loyal to his beliefs. The Americans saw him as a strong anti-communist leader who could keep order in the South. But over time, Diem's rule became harsh. He gave important jobs to his family members and close friends. His brother, Ngo Dinh, became one of the most feared men in the country. Anyone who criticized the government was arrested or worse. Most people in Vietnam were Buddhists, but Diem and his family were Catholic. Instead of treating everyone equally, Diem gave Catholics special privileges in education, jobs, and land. This made many Buddhists feel angry and betrayed. When Buddhist monks began to protest peacefully, Diem's forces responded with violence. In one of the most shocking moments, in 1963, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc set himself on fire in the streets of Saigon to protest Diem's cruelty. The image shocked the world and deeply damaged Diem's reputation. While leaders fought over politics, the people in villages suffered the most. Most Vietnamese lived in small, rural communities surrounded by rice paddies. Their days began at sunrise and ended at sunset, filled with hard work and the sounds of insects, wind, and water. But peace never lasted long. Villagers in the South often found themselves caught between two forces: the Viet Cong, who asked for food, shelter, and support, the South Vietnamese army, who demanded loyalty to the government. If they helped one side, the other might punish them later. Many families lost loved ones, homes, and hope. The war had not yet become official, but for those living in the countryside, violence was already part of daily life. In the late 1950s, a new movement began to grow in South Vietnam. It was called the Viet Cong, short for Vietnamese Communists. They were supported by North Vietnam, but they lived and fought in the South. The Viet Cong didn't wear uniforms. They blended in with villagers, farmers by day, fighters by night. They knew the land, the rivers, the forests, the tunnels, better than any army could. They attacked police stations, military posts, and government offices using guerrilla warfare, small, surprise attacks that caused big damage. They also built secret tunnels under the ground where they could hide, plan, and store weapons. The U.S. military and South Vietnamese forces found it nearly impossible to tell who was a friend and who was an enemy. A smiling farmer could turn out to be a Viet Cong soldier. The jungle itself became a weapon, full of traps, ambushes, and unseen dangers. By the early 1960s, the United States was spending millions of dollars supporting South Vietnam. They sent weapons, supplies, and military advisors. Not yet combat troops, but people who trained the South Vietnamese army. One of the most important moments came in 1961, when John F. Kennedy became President of the United States. He promised to stop the spread of communism around the world. Vietnam to him was a test of America's strength and belief in freedom. Kennedy sent more advisors, bringing the number up to over 16,000 by 1963. Helicopters began to appear over the jungles. American pilots flew alongside South Vietnamese soldiers, teaching them new strategies. But despite all this help, the South Vietnamese government continued to struggle. Corruption, fear, and anger spread. Many in the U.S. government started to lose faith in No Dinh Diem. By 1963, protests were breaking out across South Vietnam. The Buddhist crisis had turned into a national movement. Even members of Diem's own army began to question his leadership. In November 1963, South Vietnamese generals, with quiet support from the U.S., decided to act. They staged a coup, a secret plan to remove Diem from power. Diem and his brother were captured and killed. When news of his death spread, many hoped it would bring peace, but instead it created more chaos. Without Diem, South Vietnam had no strong or stable government. Leaders came and went quickly, some lasting only a few months. The country became weaker and the Viet Cong grew stronger. For the U.S., this meant one thing: they could no longer stand by as observers. If they wanted to stop communism from spreading, they would have to step directly into the fight. While Vietnam was torn apart, the rest of the world was locked in the Cold War, a tense struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The two superpowers didn't fight each other directly, but they supported wars and revolutions in other countries, like pieces in a global chess game. To the Americans, the battle in Vietnam was not just about one small country. It was about defending freedom and proving democracy could survive. To the Soviets and the Chinese, supporting the North meant spreading communism and challenging American influence. Vietnam, a narrow strip of land in Southeast Asia, had now become a symbol of something much bigger: the global struggle between two ideologies. Vietnam's geography made it both beautiful and brutal. It was a country of mountains, jungles, and long, winding rivers. The weather was hot and humid, with heavy rains that could flood entire villages. The jungles were thick and dark, filled with snakes, insects, and leeches. Soldiers had to move quietly, carrying heavy packs often soaked in sweat and mud. The land became both friend and enemy. It protected local fighters who knew it well and trapped those who didn't. Foreign soldiers often found themselves lost, exhausted, and afraid. This natural environment would later play a huge role in shaping how the war was fought and who could survive it.
In both North and South Vietnam, stories were carefully told through newspapers, radio, and speeches. In the North, the government spoke of national unity, of finally freeing Vietnam from foreign influence. In the South, leaders warned their people about the red threat of communism, saying the North wanted to take away their freedom. In America, news of Vietnam slowly began to appear in newspapers and on television. At first, people didn't pay much attention. Vietnam seemed far away, just another small country in Asia. But soon that would change. As the conflict deepened, images of soldiers, burning villages, and crying civilians would reach American living rooms, changing how people saw the war and their own government. By the end of 1963, Vietnam was like a ticking clock, waiting to explode. The North was determined to reunite the country under communism. The South was weak and divided. The U.S. stood at the edge, unsure if it should take the next big step. Ho Chi Minh's forces in the North were patient and organized. They built a secret supply line known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of jungle paths running through Laos and Cambodia. Through this trail, they sent weapons, food, and soldiers to the Viet Cong in the South. The Americans tried to block it, but the jungle made it almost impossible. The trail became the lifeline of the North's resistance, a symbol of their determination to reunite the country at any cost. By the mid-1960s, Vietnam was no longer just a divided nation, it was a land on the edge of full-scale war. The U.S. believed it was defending democracy, the North believed it was fighting for freedom and unity. And the people in between, the villagers, the farmers, the families, were caught in the middle of something far bigger than themselves. The war was coming, not just small battles or secret raids, but a full, open conflict that would draw in tens of thousands of soldiers, shake the world's politics, and leave scars that would last for generations. The peace of the rice fields was fading. The sound of helicopters and gunfire was about to replace the songs of the countryside. And the next chapter of Vietnam's story would be written not by diplomats, but by soldiers. By the early 1960s, the situation in Vietnam was getting worse. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, was determined to unite the country under communist rule. The South, supported by the United States, was weak, divided, and losing control of many areas to the Viet Cong, the guerrilla fighters who wanted to overthrow the South's government. In Washington, American leaders watched nervously. They believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Asia might follow. To them, it wasn't just about Vietnam, it was about defending freedom everywhere. And so, slowly but surely, the United States began to step deeper into the war. In August 1964, everything changed. An American destroyer ship, the USS Maddox, was patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. According to reports, North Vietnamese boats fired torpedoes at it. A few days later, another attack was reported, though to this day, no one knows for sure if it actually happened. Still, those reports were enough. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had taken office after the death of President Kennedy, went before Congress and asked for permission to respond. Congress quickly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson the power to take all necessary measures to protect American forces and stop communist aggression. In simple words, it meant the U.S. could now send combat troops into Vietnam and start a full war. America was officially entering the Vietnam War. In March 1965, the first American combat troops landed in Da Nang, South Vietnam. They were young, many in their late teens or early 20s, and most had never been to Asia before. At first, they thought their mission would be short. Many believed they were helping to defend a small nation from communism, just like their fathers had fought against fascism in World War II. But the jungles of Vietnam were not like the battlefields of Europe. The enemy was hard to find. The terrain was unforgiving, thick forests, muddy rivers, mountains covered in mist, and the weather was hot, humid, and filled with mosquitoes. Still, the soldiers marched forward with courage and hope. Life for American soldiers in Vietnam was extremely difficult. They carried heavy packs, rifles, and helmets through dense jungles where visibility was often just a few meters. The Viet Cong hid traps in the ground, sharp bamboo spikes covered with mud or poison called punji sticks. A single step in the wrong place could cause terrible injuries. Sometimes the soldiers would spend days or even weeks walking without seeing the enemy. And then, out of nowhere, gunfire would explode from the trees, followed by silence. The enemy seemed invisible. They appeared suddenly and disappeared into tunnels or dense vegetation. It was like fighting shadows.
The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA, used guerrilla tactics, small, hit-and-run attacks that avoided open battles. They didn't have the airplanes, tanks, or heavy weapons that America had, so they used the land itself as their weapon. They dug thousands of miles of tunnels, especially in places like Chi near Saigon. These tunnels were dark, narrow, and dangerous, but they allowed fighters to hide, rest, and move unseen. They also set up traps, disguised bunkers, and hidden communication lines. Sometimes, an entire village supported them without the U.S. Army realizing it. The Americans called this kind of war a war without front lines. You never knew where the enemy was. You never knew who to trust. In an attempt to weaken the North, the U.S. began a massive bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965. For 3 years, American airplanes dropped millions of tons of bombs on North Vietnam and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply route used by the North to send soldiers and weapons to the South. The goal was to destroy roads, bridges, and factories, and break the will of the North Vietnamese government. But it didn't work as planned. The North rebuilt what was destroyed, often overnight. Many civilians were killed or left homeless, and the bombings only strengthened their determination to resist. From the ground, the sound of jets and explosions became part of daily life. Villagers dug underground shelters. Children learned to recognize the distant hum of bombers. The sky over Vietnam was rarely quiet. The U.S. government often said that winning the war was not just about defeating the enemy with weapons, but it was about winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. This meant convincing villagers that the South and America were there to help them, not to harm them. Soldiers built schools, roads, and wells. They gave out food and medicine. But it was hard to win trust in a land where bombs fell and families suffered. For many Vietnamese, it was confusing. One moment, soldiers offered food and kindness, and the next, there was gunfire and chaos. The line between friend and foe grew thinner every day. Far to the west, deep inside the jungles of Laos and Cambodia, lay a secret lifeline, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was not a single road, but a network of hidden paths used by North Vietnam to send supplies and troops to the south. Men and women carried food, weapons, and ammunition on bicycles, trucks, and even on their backs through dangerous mountain passes. American planes bombed the trail day and night, but it kept operating. No matter how many times it was attacked, the Vietnamese rebuilt it again and again. It became a symbol of their resilience and determination. Even American soldiers began to realize they weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting an idea of independence that no bomb could destroy. For the first time in history, people back in the United States could watch the war on television. Every night, families saw footage of battles, villages burning, and young American soldiers wounded or crying for help. Reporters were allowed to move freely and film the realities of war. This made the Vietnam War very different from previous wars. It entered people's living rooms. At first, most Americans supported the war, believing they were defending freedom. But as the years went by and the death toll rose, opinions began to change. Parents watched as their sons went off to fight and sometimes never returned. The war began to divide the United States just as much as it divided Vietnam. The U.S. Army needed more men, so the government started a draft, meaning young men were required by law to join the military if their names were chosen. Many were frightened,
they didn't understand why they were being sent to fight in a country they had never heard of. Some refused to go, and others fled to neighboring countries like Canada to avoid the draft. For those who did go, the experience was unforgettable and often traumatic. The soldiers faced not only the dangers of war, but also loneliness, confusion, and moral struggle. They didn't know who the enemy truly was. Sometimes they saw villages destroyed by mistake, and the guilt stayed with them forever. When they returned home, they found that many people no longer saw them as heroes, but as victims of a war that few understood or wanted anymore. One of the first major battles between the U.S. and North Vietnamese forces happened in 1965 in the Ia Drang Valley. It was fierce, chaotic, and deadly. Helicopters carried troops into the heart of enemy territory. Machine guns echoed through the jungle. Smoke filled the air. Both sides suffered heavy losses. For the U.S., it was proof that their modern weapons could fight effectively. For the North, it showed that even against the strongest army in the world, they could still stand their ground. Ia Drang became a symbol of what the rest of the war would be: long, painful, and costly with no clear winner. By 1966, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. Villages were burned, forests destroyed, and rivers polluted by chemicals used to remove jungle cover, such as Agent Orange. This chemical warfare harmed not only the plants, but also the people. It caused illness, birth defects, and suffering that continued long after the war ended. Innocent civilians, men, women, and children were caught in the crossfire. Entire communities vanished, and the land that once fed generations was scarred by craters and fire. In the middle of all this, soldiers from both sides began to ask the same question: why are we fighting? By 1967, the United States had over 400,000 troops in Vietnam. Helicopters filled the skies, bombers roared overhead, and soldiers marched through jungles that seemed endless. But despite all the power, victory remained out of reach. The Viet Cong continued to attack. The North refused to surrender, and the people of Vietnam, exhausted and frightened, saw no end to their suffering. Back in America, protests were starting to rise. Students, teachers, and even parents began to question whether this war was truly worth the cost. The world was watching. The soldiers were fighting. And Vietnam, once a land of rice fields and rivers, had now become the center of a storm that no one could control. The next phase of this story would change everything, because the war was about to reach its breaking point. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was no longer just a war between North and South Vietnam. It had become a global issue, one that divided not only countries, but also hearts, families, and generations. The sounds of helicopters and gunfire echoed through the jungles of Southeast Asia, but their echoes reached far beyond, into classrooms, homes, and streets across the world. This was the chapter where the world began to react. In earlier wars, people back home could only imagine what battles looked like. But the Vietnam War was different. It was called the First Television War. Every night, people in the United States, and even in other countries, turned on their televisions and saw real footage from Vietnam. Soldiers marching through muddy fields, villages burning, children crying, helicopters carrying the wounded. For the first time in history, war wasn't hidden behind words and speeches. It was visible. It was personal. And it began to change how people felt about what their governments were doing. At first, most Americans supported the war. They believed they were helping to stop the spread of communism. But as the years went by and more young soldiers came home in coffins, people began to ask, why are we fighting this war? By 1967, protests were spreading across the United States. Students, teachers, musicians, and even priests joined what became known as the peace movement. They held marches in cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco. Some carried signs that said, "Make love, not war. Bring our boys home." Songs like "Give Peace a Chance" and "Blowin' in the Wind" became anthems of the time.
Music, art, and poetry became tools of protest, gentle, creative ways of asking for peace. The protests weren't just about Vietnam. They were about the meaning of war itself. People questioned the government's honesty. They saw news reports that didn't match official statements, and they began to feel that something was wrong. Young men burned their draft cards, papers that called them to military service. Some refused to fight. Others fled to Canada or went to jail instead of going to war. Universities became centers of resistance. Students held sit-ins and marches. In 1970, at Kent State University, a peaceful protest turned tragic when the National Guard opened fire, killing 4 students. The nation was shocked. The message was clear. The war was no longer only being fought in Vietnam, it was being fought inside America itself, in the hearts and minds of its people. In January 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year celebration known as Tet, both sides agreed to a brief truce. For a moment, it seemed there might be calm. But the calm didn't last. In the early hours of January 30th, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong launched a massive surprise attack across South Vietnam. They struck over 100 cities and towns, including the capital, Saigon. It was called the Tet Offensive. For weeks, fierce battles raged. The U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually regained control, and militarily, they won. But in another sense, they lost, because the world had seen something powerful. Television footage showed the U.S. Embassy in Saigon under attack, soldiers fighting street by street, and civilians fleeing in panic. Many people watching from home thought, if we are winning this war, why does it look like we're losing? The Tet Offensive changed everything. It made Americans question whether victory was even possible. It showed that the North Vietnamese were far stronger and more determined than anyone had realized. Before Tet, most American news outlets supported the war. After Tet, that began to change. One of the most respected journalists in America, Walter Cronkite, visited Vietnam and reported back to the public. He said on national television, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." When the President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, heard that, he reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He realized that public trust had vanished. People no longer believed in the war, and without belief, there could be no victory. By 1968, America was deeply divided. Families argued at dinner tables. Some parents supported the government, while their children marched in protests. The generation gap had never felt so wide. The war also began to affect American culture. Movies, songs, and even fashion reflected a desire for peace and change. The hippie movement, with its bright colors and calls for love, became a symbol of hope in dark times. But behind the peace signs and flowers, the pain of loss was everywhere. More than 500 soldiers were dying every week. Many of them were just teenagers. And for every soldier lost, there was a family waiting back home, a mother, a father, a friend who would never be the same again. The Vietnam War was not just America's war. It became the world's war. In Europe, protests broke out in London, Paris, and Berlin. In Japan, students demonstrated in front of U.S. military bases. Even in Australia and Canada, people questioned their country's support for America's actions. The images of burning villages and suffering civilians shocked people across the globe. Many began to see the war as a symbol of the world's injustice, the powerful harming the powerless. Nations that once stood with the United States started to step back. The moral weight of the war was becoming too heavy to carry. While the world debated, the people of Vietnam lived the daily reality of war. Cities were bombed, villages destroyed, and the countryside turned into battlefields. Families were separated. Children grew up in fear, hiding from air raids and gunfire. In the north, people worked day and night to rebuild what bombs destroyed. In the south, many struggled to survive between two fighting forces, not knowing whom to trust. For them, this was not a political war. It was simply a fight to stay alive. They lost homes, crops, and loved ones, yet many still hoped that one day their land would know peace again. The year 1968 was one of the most turbulent in modern history. In America, protests against the war reached their peak. Civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had spoken out against the war, was assassinated in April. Just 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy, who also opposed the war, was shot and killed. The nation was in grief and confusion. Meanwhile, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago turned into chaos, with police clashing violently with protesters in front of cameras. It felt as if the entire world was coming apart. In Vietnam, the fighting continued. More soldiers were sent, more bombs fell, but the hope of victory faded into the smoke-filled skies. In March 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson made a surprising announcement. He said he would not run for re-election. Years of leading the war had exhausted him, and public anger had made it impossible for him to continue. He also promised to begin peace talks with North Vietnam. For the first time, both sides were willing to sit at a table, even if they didn't yet agree on anything. But peace was still far away. In 1969, Richard Nixon became President of the United States. He promised to bring peace with honor. That meant ending the war, but not in a way that looked like defeat. He introduced a plan called Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese soldiers to take over the fighting while American troops gradually went home. At the same time, Nixon secretly expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, trying to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the Viet Cong's hidden bases. When the public learned about these secret bombings, outrage exploded again. The protests grew louder, and the trust between citizens and their leaders grew thinner. By the end of the 1960s, it was clear that the war was no longer just about Vietnam. It was about truth, trust, and the soul of a generation. The Tet Offensive had shown that military victory might be impossible. The protests had shown that public support was gone. The world had seen the suffering, and it could not be unseen. The Vietnam War had become more than a conflict of nations. It had become a mirror showing humanity its own fears, mistakes, and hopes. The next chapter would tell of a slow withdrawal, painful decisions, and the final moments of a war that changed the world forever.
By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had been going on for nearly a decade. The jungles were scarred, the cities damaged, and millions of lives had been lost. In America, families had grown tired of waiting for peace. Students marched in protest. Mothers cried over folded flags. Even soldiers far away in the fields of Vietnam began to wonder when they would finally go home. Everyone was asking the same question: when will this war end? In 1969, Richard Nixon became President of the United States. He had promised during his campaign that he had a secret plan to end the war. But ending the Vietnam War was not simple, because it wasn't just about Vietnam anymore. It was about pride, politics, and the image of power. Nixon didn't want America to look weak or defeated. He said he would bring peace with honor. That meant finding a way to stop fighting, but still leaving behind a strong South Vietnam. His plan was called Vietnamization. Vietnamization meant that the South Vietnamese army would take over most of the fighting, and the American soldiers would gradually return home. Nixon believed that if South Vietnam could defend itself, America could leave without losing face. The U.S. started training more South Vietnamese troops, sending them weapons, and reducing the number of American soldiers step by step. At the same time, Nixon ordered heavy bombing on North Vietnam to pressure them into peace talks. He wanted to show that even as America withdrew, it still had strength. But for the people living in Vietnam, it meant one thing: the war continued. In 1969 and 1970, Nixon secretly authorized bombing raids not just in North Vietnam, but also in Cambodia and Laos, neighboring countries that were supposed to be neutral. Why? Because North Vietnam was using those countries to send supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the hidden network of jungle paths that connected North and South. The secret bombings destroyed villages, killed thousands of civilians, and caused chaos in Cambodia. When the truth finally came out in the news, Americans were furious. It seemed the war wasn't ending, it was spreading. The revelation of the Cambodian bombings in 1970 brought a new wave of protests across the United States. Students and activists filled the streets again, chanting for an immediate end to the war. At Kent State University, students gathered for a peaceful protest. But things turned tragic when the National Guard opened fire on the crowd, killing 4 students. The nation was shocked. Photographs of the event spread everywhere, showing a young woman kneeling beside a fallen student, crying out in grief. It became one of the most haunting images of the entire era. The message was clear. The war wasn't just destroying Vietnam, it was tearing apart America, too. In 1971, another truth shook the country. A former government analyst named Daniel Ellsberg leaked a set of secret government documents to the press. They became known as the Pentagon Papers. These papers revealed that for years, several U.S. presidents had misled the public about the war, about how it started, how it was going, and what they really believed about winning it. The government had known early on that victory might be impossible, but kept sending soldiers anyway. The American people felt betrayed. Many lost trust in their leaders completely. Protests grew larger, and calls to "bring our boys home" filled the streets of every major city. Meanwhile, peace negotiations were taking place in Paris, France. Representatives from North Vietnam, South Vietnam, the United States, and the Viet Cong sat across the table. They talked for years, from 1968 to 1973. But every time one side made a proposal, the other side disagreed. The biggest question was simple but deeply emotional. Who would control Vietnam after the war? North Vietnam wanted the country united under communist rule. The U.S. wanted South Vietnam to remain independent and non-communist. Neither side wanted to back down. So while leaders debated in Paris, soldiers kept dying in Vietnam. In 1970, Nixon announced that American and South Vietnamese troops had invaded Cambodia to destroy Viet Cong bases. He said it was to shorten the war, but instead it sparked massive outrage. Hundreds of universities shut down in protest. In Washington, D.C., over 100,000 people marched to demand an end to the war. Many Americans no longer believed in the government's promises. They felt trapped in a war that made no sense, a war where victory had no clear meaning anymore. By 1972, America had withdrawn most of its troops. From a peak of over 500,000 soldiers, Fewer than 100,000 remained. But Nixon still wanted to show strength. When peace talks stalled, he ordered a new wave of bombings on Hanoi and Haiphong, the two largest cities in North Vietnam. The raids, known as the Christmas bombings of 1972, dropped over 20,000 tons of explosives in just 2 weeks. The attacks killed thousands and destroyed homes, hospitals, and schools. The world watched in horror. Even some of America's allies spoke out, calling the attacks brutal and unnecessary. Finally, both sides realized enough was enough. In January 1973, after years of fighting and negotiation, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement said a ceasefire would begin. All American troops would leave Vietnam. Prisoners of war would be released, and North and South Vietnam would remain separate, at least for now. For Americans, it meant that the long, painful chapter of war was finally coming to an end. For Vietnamese people, it meant the beginning of a new kind of struggle, one that would decide their country's future. In March 1973, the last U.S. soldiers left Vietnam. For the first time in over a decade, there were no American troops in the jungles or skies of Southeast Asia. The war, at least for the United States, was over. Even after the U.S. withdrawal, the fighting didn't stop. The North Vietnamese army continued pushing south, determined to reunite the country. The South Vietnamese government, though better equipped, struggled to stand on its own. Without American air support and money, it began to crumble. Villages once again became battlefields. The fragile peace collapsed. The war that had torn Vietnam for 20 years was reaching its final heartbreaking end. On April 30, 1975, the North Vietnamese army entered Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. Helicopters rushed to the rooftops of the American embassy, trying to evacuate the last U.S. citizens and their South Vietnamese allies. Thousands of people crowded the gates, desperate to escape. Some clung to helicopters as they lifted off. Others watched from the ground as the flag of South Vietnam was lowered for the last time. When the North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace, the war, after 20 long years, was finally over. Saigon fell. Vietnam was reunited under communist rule. The new government renamed the city Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the leader who had dreamed of a united Vietnam since his youth. The Vietnam War left behind unimaginable pain. More than 58,000 Americans died. Over 300,000 were wounded. But for Vietnam, the cost was far greater. Over 2 million civilians and 1 million soldiers lost their lives. Entire villages disappeared. Fields were burned, rivers polluted, and forests destroyed. Even after the war, the land remained poisoned by chemicals like Agent Orange. Children were born with illnesses, and unexploded bombs continued to take lives long after the fighting stopped. It wasn't just a war between armies. It was a war that scarred a nation's soul. When the guns finally went silent, the world began to reflect. The Vietnam War had shown that even the most powerful country could not easily win a war without clear purpose or understanding of the people they fought among. It had shown that bombs and guns could not win hearts and minds. It changed how wars were fought, how governments were questioned, and how people thought about power and truth. The Vietnam War became a symbol, a warning of what happens when humanity forgets the cost of conflict. As American troops returned home, they did not receive parades or celebrations. Many faced anger, confusion, or silence. They had fought bravely, but they came home to a country that no longer believed in the war they had fought. Some carried visible scars, others carried invisible ones, memories of jungles, fire, and loss that would never fade. And across the ocean, in the green valleys of Vietnam, families mourned their loved ones, villages rebuilt from ashes, and children grew up listening to stories of a war that had taken everything and taught the world the meaning of peace. When the guns went silent in April 1975, the Vietnam War, one of the longest and most painful conflicts of the 20th century, had finally come to an end.
But even though the fighting stopped, the wounds it left behind would take decades to heal. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not of war, but of recovery, remembrance, and reflection. After the fall of Saigon, Vietnam was officially reunified. The country became known as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with Hanoi as its capital. The new leaders celebrated. The long dream of uniting the North and the South had come true, but the cost of that dream was enormous. The land was devastated. Bridges were broken, factories destroyed, and rice fields lay in ashes. Millions of families were mourning, some for parents, some for children, and some for those who never returned home. Vietnam had won the war, but now it had to win peace, a much harder battle. After years of bombings and battles, Vietnam's economy was shattered. Cities were filled with rubble, and the countryside was full of unexploded bombs and landmines. Many people were sick from the effects of chemical weapons like Agent Orange, which had poisoned the soil and water. The war had taken away not only lives, but also livelihoods. Farmers couldn't grow crops, children couldn't go to school, hospitals had no medicine. In some places, people lived in broken houses with no electricity or clean water. They survived with what little they had and the hope that tomorrow might be better. The government tried to rebuild the country under communist rule. Land was redistributed, industries were nationalized, and new schools were built. But recovery was slow, and for many, life remained very difficult. After 1975, not everyone felt safe or hopeful under the new government. Thousands of people, especially from the South, feared punishment or re-education camps. They decided to flee. They became known as the boat people. Families climbed onto small fishing boats and sailed into the open sea, hoping to reach nearby countries like Malaysia, Thailand, or the Philippines, and eventually countries like the United States, Canada, or Australia. The journey was dangerous. Many boats sank, storms, hunger, and pirates claimed countless lives. But for those who survived, it was a journey from war to freedom. Their stories became another painful chapter in the legacy of Vietnam, a story not of soldiers, but of ordinary people searching for peace. For America, too, the war left deep scars. More than 58,000 soldiers had died in Vietnam. Over 300,000 came home wounded both in body and mind. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a deep emotional pain that haunted them for years. But when they returned home, there were no cheering crowds, no parades, no medals waiting. Instead, many were met with silence, confusion, or even anger. The war had become so unpopular that some Americans blamed the soldiers themselves, even though they had only followed orders and fought bravely. It took years before the nation began to honor them properly. In 1982, a memorial was built in Washington, D.C. It was called the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, a long black wall engraved with the names of every American who had died in the war. Visitors walked slowly along the wall, tracing their fingers over the names, sometimes leaving flowers, letters, or dog tags. It is quiet there, a place not of politics, but of remembrance. The Vietnam War also changed how Americans viewed their government. The Pentagon Papers had shown that the truth about the war had been hidden for years. Presidents and officials had told the public one thing while believing something entirely different. This realization broke the trust between citizens and their leaders. For the first time, many Americans began to question their government openly. They wanted transparency, honesty, and accountability. The phrase credibility gap, the difference between what the government said and what people believed, became famous during this time. It was one of the lasting consequences of Vietnam, a reminder that truth in war is as important as victory. The Vietnam War taught the world many lessons written not in textbooks, but in blood, courage, and sorrow. Lesson 1. War is easier to begin than to end. At first, leaders thought sending a few thousand soldiers would be enough.
But the war grew and grew until it became impossible to control. Lesson 2. Technology cannot defeat determination. America had helicopters, jets, and bombs. Vietnam had patience, courage, and an unbreakable will. In the end, willpower proved stronger than weapons. Lesson 3. Understanding people matters more than understanding maps. The U.S. tried to win by force, but it didn't understand the culture, history, and hopes of the Vietnamese people. You cannot win the heart of a nation without listening to it first. Lesson 4. Every life matters. The war showed that every soldier, every villager, every child caught in conflict pays a price. There are no true winners in war, only survivors. The Vietnam War also changed how countries around the world saw conflict. For the United States, it marked the end of blind intervention, the idea that America could solve any global problem with military power. Future presidents became far more cautious before sending troops abroad. For other nations, it was a story of inspiration and warning. Small countries saw how Vietnam, despite its size, had resisted one of the world's strongest powers. But they also saw how much suffering it caused. It became a symbol, both of resistance and the terrible cost of war. In the decades that followed, both Vietnam and the United States began to rebuild their relationship. In the 1990s, the two countries reopened diplomatic ties. Trade began again. Tourists visited the once broken cities. American veterans returned to Vietnam, not as soldiers, but as visitors. Some came to find old friends. Some came to forgive. Some came to be forgiven. They walked through rice fields and villages where they once fought and met the people who had once been their enemies. There were tears, handshakes, and stories, proof that even the deepest wounds can heal when hearts are open. Many soldiers and civilians from both sides began to share their stories in books, movies, and interviews. Films like Platoon, Apocalypse Now, and The Deer Hunter showed the pain, confusion, and humanity of those who lived through it. Writers told stories not of heroes and villains, but of people, ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. These stories helped the world see the Vietnam War not just as a history, but as a human tragedy filled with lessons for the future. Today, Vietnam is a country of peace and progress. The skyline of Ho Chi Minh City is filled with tall buildings and bright lights. Children go to school, farmers work in green fields, and markets buzz with life. The scars of war still exist, in the land, in memories, and in hearts, but they are now part of a story of survival and resilience. Vietnam has opened its doors to the world. Its people are proud, hardworking, and hopeful, a living example of how a nation can rise from its darkest days. When we look back today, the Vietnam War is not just a chapter in history. It is a reminder that every war begins with reasons, but ends with loss. That understanding, empathy, and dialogue are stronger than bullets, and that peace, though fragile, is worth every effort to protect. The war divided nations, but in its aftermath, it united humanity in reflection. It taught the world that the real victory is not in conquering others, but in learning to live together again. In the quiet countryside of Vietnam today, you can hear children laughing, roosters crowing, and farmers calling out across the fields. The rivers that once carried the echoes of war now carry boats filled with rice and flowers. The same sky that once thundered with planes now shines peacefully with stars. And in that peace, you can feel the message that the people of Vietnam and the world learned the hard way. War ends, but its lessons must live on. The story of the Vietnam War is not just about the past. It is a story about humanity, about the price of conflict, and about the strength to forgive, rebuild, and begin again.